June 17, 1961, Canton, Ohio. The afternoon heat pressed against the narrow hallway of the boarding house on Cleveland Avenue, making the faded wallpaper curl at the edges like dried leaves. The air smelled of dust, old cooking grease, and the cheap perfume Mrs. Henderson from the second floor always wore too heavily. Evangeline Mercer stood on the third-floor landing with a paper grocery sack in her arms, watching a man climb the stairs toward her. Her heart stopped. Not metaphorically. It actually seemed to cease beating for a moment, leaving her chest hollow and cold despite the summer heat. 15 years she'd lived knowing that face no longer existed in this world. 15 years she'd worn black every Sunday, mourning the man who, as she'd been told, burned to death in a B-17 over Hamburg. 15 years of assuming widowhood like a heavy coat she could never take off. But now, on this Saturday in June, when the summer sun streamed through the grimy windows and turned the dust motes into tiny golden stars, she saw Everett. Alive. Gray-haired, yes. Thinner, certainly. With different papers in his pocket and another woman's surname on the mailbox across the hall where room 3B had stood empty for 6 weeks. He raised his head. Their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw no surprise, no joy of recognition, no shock at this impossible collision of past and present. She saw calculation. The cold, instant calculation of a man measuring how many seconds he had before 15 years of carefully constructed lies collapsed around him like a house of cards in a strong wind. Evangeline didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't drop her groceries or clutch her chest or make any of the dramatic gestures women in movies always seem to make at moments like this. She simply turned, entered her room, and closed the door. The lock clicked with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Her hands didn't shake. 15 years of loneliness, poverty, and humiliation had taught her to keep her composure. 15 years of raising a child alone, of counting pennies, of going to bed hungry so her son could eat, of facing down landlords and bill collectors and well-meaning neighbors who asked intrusive questions. All of that had given her a steel core she hadn't possessed as a young bride. She walked to the kitchenette, set the groceries on the counter with careful precision, and sat in the worn wooden chair by the window. Only then, when no one could see, when the door was locked and the thin curtains drawn, did she allow herself to tremble. Her hands shook, her knees knocked together. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Because she just understood something that rewrote every assumption she'd lived with for 15 years. The man she'd mourned every single day, the man whose memory she'd kept alive for their son with stories of heroism and sacrifice, the man whose supposed death had shaped every decision she'd made. He had never died at all. He'd simply chosen another life. A life without her, and without their son. But to understand the full horror of that meeting, you have to go back. To a freezing February morning in 1946, when the telegram arrived and changed everything. February 1946 was merciless in a way that only post-war winters could be. The war had ended 6 months earlier, but the rationing continued. Coal was still scarce. Butter was still scarce. Hope was still scarce. Ice gripped Canton so hard that even the shallow Nimishillen Creek, usually muddy and restless, froze solid under a thick crust of snow. In the boarding house on Cleveland Avenue, the radiator hissed and clanked but produced little heat. Mrs. Dutton, who owned the house, kept the furnace turned low to save money, and none of the tenants could afford to complain because housing was scarce and landlords could be selective. Evangeline sat on the narrow bed, wrapped in a wool blanket and her mother's shawl, one of the few possessions she still had from before the war, before everything changed. Beside her slept Wesley, her 5-year-old son. He breathed softly through slightly parted lips, his face pressed into the pillow, a crease from the pillowcase marking his cheek like a temporary scar. He was 5 years and 6 months old. Born in August 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, in a world that still seemed innocent even though war was already consuming Europe. Back then, Everett had worked as a machinist at Timken Roller Bearing. Good, steady work. good steady pay. They'd lived in a better room on the second floor, with 2 windows instead of 1, with enough space to imagine a future. After the war, after the telegram, Mrs. Dutton had moved Evangeline to a larger room on the 3rd floor. It was an act of kindness, one of the small mercies that made life bearable. The widow's discount came with only a small increase in rent, an extra $2 a month. 12 by 14 feet. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a hot plate that worked when the electricity didn't cut out, which it did frequently in winter when everyone was trying to heat their rooms with illegal electric heaters. The knock on the door was sharp, official, the kind of knock that carries bad news in its very rhythm. Evangeline flinched, pulled on her cardigan, the brown one with the hole in the elbow that she'd darned 3 times, and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her feet. Mrs. Dutton stood there, her landlady's face tight with sympathy and dread. She'd delivered too many of these envelopes over the past 5 years. She knew what they meant. She held out a telegram and looked away, unable to meet Evangeline's eyes. __quote _0___. Evangeline took the telegram. Her hands remained steady, but something deep inside, some primal instinct that lives in the gut and knows things before the brain does, already understood what this meant. She returned to her room, sat on the edge of the bed carefully so as not to wake Wesley, and opened the telegram with fingers that felt disconnected from her body, as if they belonged to someone else. Inside was a typed message. Standard text with a name and date filled in by some anonymous clerk in some anonymous office who would never know or care about the devastation these words would cause. __quote _1___. Evangeline read those words again and again, hoping that somehow repeated reading would change them, would reveal some hidden meaning, some escape clause. July 28, 1943. The bombing campaign over Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah, they'd called it. She'd heard about it on the radio, had listened to the newsreels at the movie theater, had read the headlines in the newspapers that cost a nickel she could barely afford. That summer of '43, when the war news started sounding less desperate, when for the first time people began to believe the Germans might actually be stopped, might actually be beaten. Everett died that day. On a day when historians would later write that the tide turned, that the war began its slow pivot toward Allied victory. She folded the telegram carefully, as if it were something precious rather than something poisonous, and placed it in the dresser drawer. And only then did she cry. Quietly, without sobs, with a silence born of practice, because in a boarding house with thin walls, you learn to keep your grief private. Tears ran down her face, dripped onto her cardigan, left dark spots on the brown wool. She was 26 years old. She was a widow, one of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women whose husbands would never come home. Wesley woke an hour later. He rubbed his eyes with small fists, blinked in the gray morning light, looked at his mother with those wide gray eyes that were exactly like Everett's. __quote _2___. Evangeline wiped her face with her sleeve, leaving a wet streak across the brown wool. Quote 3, quote 4. The question drove through her like a knife. Wesley asked about his father every day, every single day. He'd been asking for nearly 4 years now, ever since Everett left. Every day he waited. Every day he hoped. How do you tell a 5-year-old that hope is dead? She sat beside him, pulled him close, felt his small, warm body against hers. Papa's not coming home, Wesley. Papa died. He was a hero. He was protecting us from bad people far away. Wesley stared at her with those gray eyes that would haunt her for years. He didn't understand what death meant yet. Didn't understand never. Didn't understand that some absences are permanent. But he saw that his mother was crying. He saw that something had broken. And he cried too, not because he understood, but because children mirror their parents' pain even when they can't comprehend its source. Evangeline held him, rocked him, stroked his hair that was the same sandy brown as Everett's, whispered soothing words that felt like lies in her mouth because nothing would ever be soothing again. But inside her a void was expanding, huge, cold, bottomless, a void that would never be filled. She was alone, truly alone. Alone with a 5-year-old child, in a battered country where every family was mourning their dead, where grief was so common it had become almost banal. But the real horror didn't come then. The real horror began 15 years later, when she learned the telegram had been a lie. Evangeline met Everett in 1938, in a world that seemed stable and predictable, before anyone could imagine what was coming. She was 18, fresh-faced and hopeful, still believing in the possibility of happiness. He was 20, already working, already a man in ways she wasn't yet a woman. She'd just finished secretarial school, a 6-month course that cost her father $30 he couldn't afford, and gotten a job in the payroll office at Timken, where Everett worked as a machinist in the ball bearing division. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with large worker's hands calloused from handling metal and tools. Not handsome exactly. His features were too rough for that, his nose slightly crooked from a childhood break, his chin too square. But there was something reliable about him. Something solid. Something that made you want to trust him, to lean on him, to believe he would always be there. He walked her home from work those first few weeks, always staying a respectful distance until she invited him closer. Brought her apples from his father's orchard out in Tuscarawas County, crisp autumn apples that tasted like sunshine and possibility. Spoke little but always to the point, never wasting words or making empty promises. He didn't drink much, didn't curse, didn't go to church either. But in those days, that was more virtue than vice. Churches were for old people and housewives, and modern young people were building a new world. They married in April 1939. Quietly, without fanfare, without any of the celebration that weddings were supposed to have. They got their license at City Hall, a single dollar for the paperwork, and then stopped at Betty's Diner on Market Street for meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the daily special that cost 35 cents a plate. They didn't have money for anything fancy, and neither wanted it anyway. Simplicity seemed like honesty. They were happy. Or Evangeline was happy, and Everett seemed happy too, though looking back later she would wonder if she'd ever really known what he was thinking. The first year of marriage was quiet and steady, like a calm river. Everett worked his shifts at the plant. Evangeline worked her hours in the payroll office, calculating wages and deductions, her fingers flying across the adding machine. Evenings they sat in their room, drank coffee that Evangeline made on the hot plate, talked about small things, the weather, the news, Mrs. Kravitz's cat that kept getting into the garbage. The other boarders were noisy but not mean. Old Mrs. Kravitz from down the hall sometimes brought over bread pudding swimming in vanilla sauce, a luxury that made Evangeline's eyes water with gratitude. She gave Mrs. Kravitz her sugar ration stamps in return when rationing started, a fair trade in wartime. Life moved slowly, peacefully, like a summer river that didn't know a waterfall was coming. Wesley was born in August 1940. The delivery was difficult, longer than it should have been. Evangeline spent 5 days in Altman Hospital, 5 days that cost more money than they had, that put them in debt for months afterward. When they finally released her, Everett met her at the entrance, waiting on the steps in his best shirt, the blue one without any stains. He carried the bundle with their son so carefully, like it was made of glass or gold or something more precious than either. And he smiled, broadly, openly, with childlike joy that transformed his rough features into something almost beautiful. Evangeline remembered that smile. It burned into her memory like a photograph, like something permanent. Because when Everett left for the war 14 months later, he smiled differently. Crooked. Forced. Like a man who knew he was walking into a slaughterhouse but wouldn't let it show, wouldn't burden his wife with his fear. The war started on December 7th, 1941. Evangeline was making breakfast when Mrs. Dutton came running up the stairs, shouting about the radio. about Pearl Harbor, about bombs and ships burning in the harbor. Everett received his draft notice on December 12th. 5 days. That's all the time they had to prepare for everything to change. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. Induction center in Cleveland, basic training somewhere in the South. He wasn't allowed to say where. And then, the unknown. Evangeline saw him off at the train station on a cold December morning with snow falling and Wesley crying because he didn't understand why Papa was leaving. Wesley wasn't even a year and a half old yet. He sat on her hip, reaching for his father with both hands, making that desperate grabbing motion that babies make. Everett kissed his son's head, buried his face in the baby's hair for a long moment, then hugged Evangeline so tightly she couldn't breathe. His face against her neck was wet. He was crying, she realized. Everett, who never cried, who believed men didn't cry, was crying. Quote 7, quote, he whispered. Quote 8, quote. Evangeline nodded because she couldn't speak. She believed. Everyone believed then that the war would end quickly, that the boys would come marching home by Christmas, maybe next Christmas if things went badly, that husbands, fathers, brothers would return, and everything would be like before. No one imagined 4 years. No one imagined millions dead. Letters from Everett came irregularly, subject to the whims of military mail and censors' black pens. The first arrived after 6 weeks. Short, sparse, written in his careful block printing. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 9, underscore, underscore. Then, 2 more came close together. Then, a year of silence that nearly drove Evangeline mad with worry. Then, 1 letter in early 1943, longer than the others. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 10, underscore, underscore. That was it. Nothing more came. Until February 1946, when the telegram arrived and made waiting pointless. Evangeline's life after the telegram became a succession of gray, identical days that blurred together into a monotonous nightmare. Work, home, Wesley. Work, home, Wesley. She rose at 5 in the morning when it was still dark, when the boarding house was silent except for the creaking pipes and occasional cough from another room. Made breakfast from whatever the ration books allowed, usually oatmeal, sometimes an egg if she was lucky. Woke her son, fed him, dressed him in whatever clothes still fit, walked him 6 blocks to the church nursery school where they charged 25 cents a day she could barely afford. Then went to work. The garment factory sat in a converted warehouse near the railroad tracks, a 3-story brick building that smelled of machine oil and dye and the sweat of 40 women working long shifts. 20 sewing machines rattling like machine guns, mountains of fabric in various states of assembly, and the perpetual smell that got into your hair and clothes and never quite came out. Evangeline had started as a seamstress but worked her way up to floor supervisor, checking quality, managing schedules, dealing with the constant small crises that arose. Her fingers moved automatically. Her mind thought about other things. How to feed Wesley. How to get shoes for winter. His current pair had holes in both soles. How to fix the broken radio that was their only entertainment. Her salary was meager, $32 a week. In 1946, that wasn't enough to live on. Plus the widow's pension from the Veterans Administration, $18 a month, a pittance that barely covered rent. Total, about $46 a week. With that, she had to clothe, shoe, and feed herself and a child. Buy coal when it was available. Pay for the nursery school. Cover the doctor when Wesley got sick, which he did frequently that first winter. Evangeline economized on everything. Wore the same dress day after day, washed it in the sink every night, hung it to dry on a line across the room. Darned stockings until they were more patch than original nylon. Wore shoes until the soles separated from the uppers, then had them resold at the cobbler's for 50 cents because new shoes cost $4 she didn't have. Ate once a day, usually dinner, so Wesley could have breakfast and lunch. At night, when her son slept, when the boarding house was quiet, She sat by the window and cried, quietly, so the other boarders wouldn't hear through the thin walls. Tears rolled down her face, fell onto the windowsill, left watermarks on the painted wood. She didn't know how to keep going, didn't know where to find strength, didn't know if she could survive another day, another week, another year of this endless gray struggle. But in the morning she got up, always. No matter how little sleep she'd gotten, no matter how much she hurt, no matter how hopeless everything seemed. Made breakfast, fed her son, went to work. Because there was no choice. Because Wesley depended on her. Because there was no other way. Because women like her didn't get the luxury of giving up. Wesley grew up quiet, obedient, too serious for a child. He didn't throw tantrums, didn't ask for toys, didn't complain when he was hungry or cold or wearing shoes that hurt. It was as if he understood, with some deep instinctive knowledge that children shouldn't possess, that his mother already had enough burdens, that adding to them would be cruel. At 6, he started school. Public school now, free, one less expense. Did well. Brought home B's and A's on report cards that Evangeline hung on the wall with pride because there was so little else to be proud of. The only thing that worried her was that Wesley never laughed. Never. He smiled sometimes, politely, restrainedly, the way adults smile at strangers. But never laughed. Never made the joyful, spontaneous noise that children were supposed to make. Didn't run with the neighborhood boys who played stickball in the street. Didn't play army like all the kids his age, even though war was all they knew. He stayed inside, read books from the library. The library card was free, books were free, reading was an escape that cost nothing. Or helped his mother with chores. Swept floors with a broom too big for him. Peeled potatoes at the sink standing on a chair. Carried water from the communal bathroom down the hall. Wesley, Evangeline would say, go outside and play. Go have fun with the other boys. He'd shake his head, always the same gesture. She didn't insist. She understood. The war had stolen his childhood too. Stolen his father, stolen his innocence, stolen the carefree years that children were supposed to have. Years passed with the slow inevitability of a river flowing to the sea. Wesley finished elementary school, started junior high at Wilson Middle School. Evangeline still worked at the factory, still pushed through despite the pain that was becoming constant now, arthritis in her hands, chronic back pain from years of poor posture at the sewing machines. Her hands aged faster than the rest of her. By 30, they looked 50, knuckles swollen, fingers stiff in the morning. But she kept going. She had no choice. In 1950, Wesley was 10. Evangeline was 30. She looked 40. Gray strands appearing in her brown hair, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Worn down by work and worry. But she didn't complain. Complaining changed nothing. Didn't ask for help. Help wasn't coming. Just kept living. Day by day, hour by hour. Wesley started high school in 1954. Tall now, nearly 6 feet, thin from never having quite enough to eat. Quiet, serious, carrying himself with an adult gravity that made him seem older than 14. He helped his mother more than ever now that he was strong enough to be useful. Got a part-time job at the A&P stocking shelves after school and on weekends. $5 a week. Gave every penny to Evangeline. She tried to refuse, told him to save for college, told him he'd need it for his future. He shook his head with that same stubborn gesture he'd had since childhood. We need it now, Mama. He was right. They did. Evangeline's salary hadn't increased much. The factory owner was cheap, squeezed every penny. Everything cost more. Bread that had been 8 cents a loaf in 1946 now cost 12. Rent had gone up twice. The widow's pension helped, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. They scraped by, month after month, year after year, living on the knife edge of poverty, where one unexpected expense could tip you into catastrophe. Wesley graduated high school in 1958, didn't go to college even though his grades were good enough for the local university, couldn't afford it. Even the cheapest state school cost hundreds of dollars a year, might as well have been millions. Got a job at Republic Steel instead. Manual labor, hard work, dangerous work. Men got injured regularly, lost fingers, crushed hands. But it paid better than the grocery store. He was 18, already a man in all the ways that mattered, already supporting his mother, already carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to someone twice his age. Then came June 17, 1961, a Saturday, the day that rewrote everything Evangeline thought she knew about her life. Wesley was 20 now, still working at the steel mill, still giving most of his paycheck to his mother. He'd moved into a rented room on the south side 6 months earlier, trying to give his mother some space, some relief from having to take care of him, from having to share the tiny room. Evangeline still lived in the boarding house. Mrs. Dutton was dead now, had died 3 years ago of a stroke. Her daughter Margaret ran the place now, not as kind, not as forgiving about late rent. Evangeline climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, carrying groceries from the A&P in a paper sack that was coming apart at the bottom. She'd have to carry it carefully to avoid losing everything. She reached her landing and stopped. Across the hall, a man was unlocking the door to room 3B. The room had been empty for weeks. The previous tenant, Mr. O'Brien, had died of a heart attack, and Margaret had been trying to rent it. Now someone new had moved in. The man turned. Their eyes met. Time stopped. It was Everett. Older, grayer, thinner, but unmistakably Everett. Her husband. The man who died in 1943. The man whose death she'd mourned for 15 years. The man whose memory had shaped every day of her life since that telegram arrived. He stared at her. In his eyes, she saw not surprise, but calculation. The look of a man realizing his past had caught up with him, running scenarios, weighing options, deciding what to do in the next few seconds. Evangeline didn't faint, didn't scream, didn't drop her groceries. She turned, entered her room, closed the door, set the groceries down with trembling hands, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall. The man she'd mourned, the man she'd cried over for 15 years, the man whose memory she'd kept alive for their son with stories of heroism and sacrifice, the man whose supposed death had defined her entire adult life. He was alive, living across the hall, under a different name. She sat there for an hour, not thinking, not feeling, just sitting, numb. Then she stood, put on her coat, and walked down to the corner drugstore. Called Wesley from the payphone. 10 cents for 3 minutes. __quote _15__. Wesley arrived 30 minutes later on his bicycle. Found his mother sitting at the table, pale, still, staring at nothing. __quote _16__. Evangeline looked at her son. This young man who'd grown up fatherless, who'd never known his father except through a faded photograph in her stories, who'd missed having a father at every milestone, first day of school, Little League tryouts, high school graduation. She took a breath. "Your father is alive." Wesley stared. "What?" "He's alive. He's living across the hall. I saw him." Wesley's face went white. Quote 21. Wesley stood, paced the small room. He stopped. Understanding dawned. Wesley's hands clenched into fists. "I want to see him." "Wesley." "I need to see him, Mama. I need to look him in the eye." Evangeline nodded. They crossed the hall together. She knocked. Hard. The door opened. Everett stood there. Up close, she could see he was using hair dye to cover the gray, cheap dye that left an unnatural sheen. Wearing reading glasses that hadn't been there before. Cheaper clothes than he used to wear. But it was him. No question. he said quietly. Everett's face tightened. Can I explain? You'd better. He stepped aside. She entered. Wesley followed. The room was nearly identical to hers. Same size, same furniture, same worn carpet with a stain near the window. But there were unfamiliar things. A woman's hairbrush on the dresser, a wedding photo, Everett with a woman Evangeline didn't know, both smiling, both young. Who is that? Evangeline asked, pointing at the photo. My wife, Dorothy. Your wife? I'm your wife. You were. Legally, you still are, I suppose. I never divorced you. Evangeline felt like she'd been struck in the chest. Everett sat heavily on the bed. He paused, rubbed his face with both hands. Quote 40. Quote 41. Quote 42. Quote 43. Quote 44. Evangeline's voice was shaking now. You let me believe you were dead. Let your son grow up without a father. Let us struggle alone for 15 years while you… What? Lived a comfortable life with another woman? It wasn't comfortable. What was it like then? Tell me how abandoning your family was somehow noble. Everett had no answer. Where have you been living? Evangeline demanded. Different places. Pennsylvania first. Worked in a coal mine under a false name. Then New York. Factory work. Dorothy and I met in Buffalo. Got married in 1949. She doesn't know. About you. About Wesley. About any of it. She thinks I'm a widower from the war. Lost my wife in the Blitz in London. That's the story I told. Does she know you're a deserter? No. She thinks my name is Edward Morrison. That I served honorably. That I have nightmares because of what I saw, not because of what I did. Evangeline stood. I'm going to the police. Please don't. Why shouldn't I? You committed a crime. Multiple crimes. Desertion, fraud, bigamy. You should be in prison. I know I should. But please, Evangeline. Think about Dorothy. She's innocent in this. She doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed. And I did? I deserved 15 years of hell? Of poverty? Of raising a child alone? Of going to bed hungry? Of wearing the same dress until it fell apart? Everett bowed his head. Couldn't meet her eyes. __quote _57 __. Evangeline looked at him. This broken man in cheap clothes, living in a boarding house under a false name, married to a woman he'd lied to for 12 years. She felt no pity. Only rage. Pure, cold rage that burned like ice. I'm calling the police, she said, and walked out. Wesley was waiting in her room. She told him everything. Wesley listened in silence. When she finished, he stood, walked to the window, stared out at the street where kids were playing. Then he turned. I want to see him. I need to talk to him. Alone. Evangeline nodded. Wesley crossed the hall. Knocked. Everett opened the door. Saw Wesley standing there. This young man who was his son, who carried his jeans, his gray eyes, his sandy hair. Son. Wesley stared at him. At this stranger who was supposed to be his father. At this man he'd mourned, whose memory he'd honored, who he'd thought was a hero. Quote 61. Quote 62. Wesley's hands clenched into fists. You thought about me while you were living a new life? Starting a new family? Celebrating holidays with another woman? That's supposed to make it better? No, it doesn't make it better. Nothing makes it better. I made a choice. The wrong choice. I was a coward. I chose to save myself instead of doing my duty. Instead of coming home to you and your mother. Why? Wesley's voice broke. __quote _66 __. Everett's face crumpled. Because I was ashamed. Because I knew what I'd done was unforgivable. Because I thought it would be easier for you both if I was dead, a hero, instead of alive and a coward. Easier? Wesley's voice rose. Quote 69, quote 70, quote 71. Wesley turned to his mother. Evangeline did. 2 officers arrived within an hour, took statements, examined Everett's documents, social security card, driver's license, everything in the name Edward Morrison. Ran his fingerprints, found discrepancies. His real name wasn't Edward Morrison as his papers claimed. It was Everett Mercer. Missing in action, presumed dead. Except he wasn't dead. He was a deserter. They arrested him. The trial took place 6 weeks later in federal court downtown. The government prosecutor was a young man named Harrison, ambitious, eager to make a name prosecuting high-profile cases. He laid out the case methodically, building it piece by piece like a prosecutor should. Everett Mercer, bombardier on a B-17, bailed out over Germany in July 1943. Failed to report to Swiss authorities as required by international law. Failed to attempt return to his unit. Entered neutral Switzerland and disappeared. Returned to the United States after the war ended under false pretenses with forged documents. Lived under an assumed name. Committed bigamy by marrying a second wife without divorcing the first. Defrauded the Veterans Administration by allowing his first wife to collect a widow's pension based on false information about his death. The evidence was overwhelming. Everett's defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Kovacs, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, argued diminished capacity due to combat stress. Claimed his client had suffered a mental break, wasn't in his right mind, wasn't responsible for his actions. The prosecutor demolished the argument methodically, pointed out that Everett had functioned perfectly well for 18 years, held jobs, maintained relationships, managed finances, purchased a car, rented apartments, paid taxes under his false identity. None of that was the behavior of someone mentally incompetent. That was the behavior of someone who'd made a calculated choice to abandon his responsibilities and live a comfortable lie. Evangeline attended every day of the trial, sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, where Everett would have to see her every time he turned around. Watched the man who'd been her husband squirm under questioning, watched him try to justify the unjustifiable, watched him cry as the prosecutor tore apart his lies. Wesley sat beside her, silent and grim, jaw tight with anger that had nowhere to go. Dorothy, Everett's second wife, sat on the other side of the courtroom. She'd learned the truth when the police came, found out the man she'd married was already married, that his whole identity was a lie, that their 12 years together had been built on fraud. She looked devastated, shrunken, like someone had pulled out her bones. Evangeline felt no sympathy for her. Dorothy had lived with stolen time, stolen years that should have belonged to Evangeline and Wesley. That made her complicit, even if she hadn't known. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, found Everett guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern man named Patterson who'd lost his own son in Korea, sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. Maximum sentence for desertion. Made an example of him. Quote, 73, quote, the judge said. Quote, 74, quote. They took Everett away in handcuffs. Evangeline watched, felt nothing, just emptiness. Hollow victory. Because punishing him didn't undo the past, didn't give her back 15 years, didn't give Wesley back his childhood. 2 weeks after the conviction, Evangeline received a letter from the Veterans Administration. Official letterhead. Cold, bureaucratic language. They were terminating her widow's pension immediately. The payments had been based on false information. Everett wasn't dead, therefore she wasn't a widow, therefore she had no entitlement. The letter made no mention of demanding repayment of the 15 years of benefits she'd already received. The investigator had determined she'd had no knowledge of the fraud. Small mercy. But it meant her income was cut by nearly a quarter. $18 a month gone. Just like that. Evangeline sat at her table, staring at the letter, feeling the weight of it. 15 years she'd collected that pension. 15 years it had helped keep her and Wesley fed, helped pay the rent, helped buy coal in winter. And now it was gone because her husband had turned out to be alive. The cruelty of it was almost funny. Almost. She should have felt angry, should have felt cheated. But all she felt was tired. So tired. Wesley came by that evening. She showed him the letter. "I'll give you more," he said immediately. "I'll make up the difference. You won't have to worry." "No, you're saving to get married. You need that money for your own life." "Mama." "No, Wesley, I'll manage. I always have." And she did. She took on extra shifts at the factory, worked Saturdays now, sometimes Sundays when they needed her, cut her expenses even further, stopped buying meat except on Sundays, stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, wore shoes until they literally fell apart, then wore them anyway. But she managed, because there was no other choice, because that's what you did. You managed. Life continued, slowly, painfully, but it continued. Evangeline kept working. Wesley kept working. They didn't talk about Everett. Ever. As if he'd never existed. As if that meeting in the boarding house had been a nightmare from which they'd finally woken. Wesley married Linda in 1962, a girl from the stenographer pool at Republic Steel. Sweet girl, good girl. She'd lost her own father in the war, understood what Wesley had been through. The wedding was modest. License at City Hall. Then back to Evangeline's room for sandwiches Linda had made and a sheet cake from the grocery store bakery. 10 people total. Small gathering. But it was happy. Linda was a good girl. Quiet, hardworking, practical. She loved Evangeline immediately, treated her like her own mother, called her mom from the first day. A year later, they had a daughter. Named her Diane after Linda's mother who died in childbirth. Evangeline became a grandmother. Diane was a cheerful, noisy child, the complete opposite of her father. She laughed constantly, ran everywhere, sang songs she made up. Evangeline watched her and thought, "This is life continuing. This is what made all the suffering worthwhile. This bright, happy child who didn't know about war or hunger or abandonment, who grew up in a world that was getting better, slowly but surely." Wesley got a house in 1964, two-bedroom ranch in a new development on the edge of town. Post-war construction, cheap but solid. They moved there with Linda and Diane. Offered Evangeline the second bedroom, begged her to move in with them. She refused. "You're newlyweds still. You need your space, need your privacy. I'll be fine." "Mama, you don't have to live alone anymore." "I want to. I'm used to it. And I'm close by if you need me." She stayed in the boarding house, alone. But it was a chosen solitude now, not an imposed one. That made all the difference. She kept working, year after year. Her hands grew more arthritic, knuckles swollen, fingers stiff in the morning. Her back ached constantly from decades of poor posture, but she pushed through. In 1970, at age 50, she finally had enough Social Security credits to qualify for early retirement benefits. She retired from the factory. Her hands couldn't manage the work anymore anyway. The Social Security payments were small, about $100 a month. Combined with occasional help from Wesley and careful budgeting, it was barely enough. But she managed. Always managed. She babysat Diane when Linda worked evenings, knitted sweaters and scarves for her granddaughter, baked cookies that Diane loved, lived quietly, invisibly. One of thousands of elderly women in boarding houses across America, living on fixed incomes, making do. But at night, when no one was around, when the boarding house was quiet and dark, she thought about Everett. Not with love, not with hate, just thought. Where was he now? What was life like in prison? Did he regret what he'd done? Did he think about her? About Wesley? About the life he'd thrown away? 10 years passed. 1971. Evangeline was walking home from the grocery store on a gray November afternoon. She was 51, looked 60. Wesley lived separately now with his family. Came to visit once a month, brought groceries, helped with repairs, checked on her. They talked about weather, work, Diane's school, but never about Everett. His name was never spoken. Evangeline climbed to her floor, groceries getting heavier with each step. Stopped. A man stood by her door, old, bent, with a gray beard and hollow cheeks, prison thin, wearing cheap clothes that hung off his frame. He looked up, met her eyes. Evangeline. She recognized the voice. Everett. He'd been released. Early parole for good behavior. Quote 84, she asked, not moving closer. Quote 85. Evangeline stared at him. This man had once been her husband, father of her son. Now he was just an old man, a stranger, broken by prison and guilt. Quote 86, quote, she said quietly. Quote 87. Quote, Everett nodded. Quote 88. Quote, he turned and walked down the stairs, slowly, heavily, like each step hurt. Evangeline watched him go, then entered her room, closed the door, sat on the bed, and for the first time in 10 years allowed herself to cry. Not from grief, from relief. Because it was over. The ghost was gone. Life would continue. A year later, Evangeline learned that Everett had died. Heart attack in a flophouse in Youngstown. Alone. No money, no family, no friends. They buried him in Potter's Field, the paupers' cemetery where the nameless and forgotten went. No stone, no marker. Just a numbered plot in a field of numbered plots. Evangeline didn't attend the funeral. Wasn't even sure there was one. Didn't bring flowers. Didn't stand by the grave. She just continued living. Because that was the only thing she knew how to do. Live, despite everything. Continue. Diane grew up, graduated high school with honors in 1981, went to nursing school, married a good man, an electrician named Tom, had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Evangeline became a great-grandmother at age 62. She babysat the great-grandchildren, baked them cookies, read them stories, watched them grow up in a world so different from the one she'd known. A world where war was something on TV, not something that took your husband and left you alone. In 1982, at age 62, she finally went on full Social Security retirement. The pension wasn't much, about $250 a month. Combined with Wesley's help, he insisted on giving her $100 a month, wouldn't take no for an answer. It was enough. Barely, but enough. She lived simply, didn't need much. A room, food, heat in winter. Simple things. She lived long, longer than many of her peers who'd worked themselves to death, longer than Everett, longer than the memory of the war, which was fading now as the generation that fought it grew old and died. She died in 1991, on a cold March morning, quietly, in her sleep. Heart failure. The doctor said it was peaceful, painless. She was 71. Wesley buried his mother beside her parents in West Lawn Cemetery. The funeral was well attended. Linda, Diane, and her husband Tom, the 2 great-grandchildren, friends from the factory, neighbors from the boarding house, people whose lives she'd touched, often without knowing. The headstone read, Evangeline M. Mercer, 1920 to 1991, beloved mother and grandmother. Everett wasn't mentioned, just as he hadn't been mentioned in her life for decades. 15 years she believed he was a hero. 10 years she knew he was a coward. And 20 more she lived as if he'd never existed at all. At the funeral, Wesley stood by his mother's grave as they lowered the casket. Linda beside him, their hands clasped. Diane and her family. The great-grandchildren too young to understand. A large family. Evangeline had built it alone, Without a husband, without help, just with her own hands, her own work, her own endurance, her own refusal to break. Wesley watched the casket lower into the ground and thought about his father, about the man he didn't remember, who he'd seen only in one faded photograph before his mother burned it after the trial, who he'd once believed was a hero, then learned was a traitor, and eventually just nothing. A blank space where a father should have been. But now, standing at his mother's grave, Wesley wasn't thinking about Everett. He was thinking about Evangeline, about the woman who waited 15 years for a dead man, who raised a son alone, who worked herself to exhaustion day after day, who forgave him when he came home drunk and angry after the trial, who loved him unconditionally all his life, despite everything. And suddenly Wesley understood something he'd never quite grasped before. The real hero isn't the one who died in war. The real hero is the one who lived after it, who survived when survival seemed impossible, who didn't break when breaking would have been easier, who kept living and loving when there was nothing left to live for. His mother was a hero, more than all the soldiers combined, more than all the medals and monuments and Memorial Day speeches. The end of this story brought no triumph, no revenge, no justice. Only silence. A long, heavy silence that was louder than any words. But in that silence was something else. Memory. Not of Everett, of Evangeline, of the woman who endured, who prevailed, not against an enemy on a battlefield, not against a traitor in court. She conquered life itself, and that was the most terrible and greatest victory of all. Because sometimes surviving is more than dying heroically. Sometimes continuing to live, day after day, year after year, is the hardest test. And Evangeline passed it to the end, with her head held high, with a clear conscience, with love in her heart. She didn't forgive Everett, never didn't forget him, but she didn't let his betrayal break her either. She chose life, and that was her choice, her victory, her revenge. The cruelest revenge, not the death of an enemy, but one's own long, dignified life. A life that says, "You tried to destroy me, but I survived. I live. I love. I remember." And in that memory, there is no room for you.